What if the sweetest thing you ever tasted was the last thing you ever swallowed? They never wrote this in the official ledgers. They never told their children at the dinner table. But in a candlelit dining room somewhere in the deep south, the air thick with sugar, cinnamon, and heat, 8 men tasted the same dessert and never lived to tell the recipe. Why was this story buried? Who was protecting it? And why does one enslaved woman's name, Judith, still make plantation records suddenly fall silent? Because desserts were not supposed to kill, and cooks, enslaved women, were not supposed to fight back. Yet this truth, if you follow it far enough, changes the way you see every elegant banquet, every silver spoon, and every master who thought he could never be touched. The kitchens of the southern plantations were places most visitors never saw, and perhaps that was intentional. They were not grand halls with glittering chandeliers or sweeping staircases that proclaimed wealth to outsiders. They were hot, suffocating rooms tucked behind the main house, hidden away from polite society, places where sweat dripped onto wooden floors and fire cracked against iron pots. The air was always thick, thicker than the humid night outside. Smoke clung to the walls, mixing with the tang of fat and the sweetness of sugar. It was here, in these closed spaces, that the true engines of plantation wealth turned silently. Food, prepared by enslaved hands, not only filled the bellies of the masters, but helped sustain the illusion of refinement, civility, and abundance. The reality, however, was different. Every plate that went out to the dining table carried the fingerprints of the enslaved, and in those fingerprints lay quiet possibilities, both of survival and of defiance. Enslaved women were often forced into these roles, chosen for their skill and endurance. They worked before dawn and often long after midnight, their days marked by endless stirring, chopping, kneading, and baking. They knew the tastes of the masters better than the masters' wives did, understood the precise balance of sweetness or salt that would bring a smile or a sneer. They were invisible in their service, yet intimately powerful in ways the masters would never admit. For in every pot of stew, in every slice of pie, in every sugared cake, lay the potential for something more than nourishment. Kitchens were not simply workplaces, they were crucibles of memory and survival. Recipes were passed down from woman to woman, sometimes altered, sometimes hidden. Techniques whispered in hushed tones carried fragments of Africa, fused with the strange and brutal world of America. The plantation demanded delicacies that mimicked European elegance, and it was the enslaved cooks who mastered those recipes, perfecting them until they seemed effortless. But under that perfection lay an undercurrent of quiet resistance. The kitchen was one of the few places where enslaved women had access to ingredients, to tools, and to the bodies of their oppressors. There was a reason plantation owners trusted their cooks so implicitly, and also why they feared them more than they admitted. A master could beat a field hand into the soil, but the cook held the keys to his table, to his wine, to his most private moments of pleasure. He might swagger and command in the fields, but when he sat down to a meal, his life was in her hands. This unspoken truth created a tension that lingered in the air, never voiced but always present. Guests could marvel at the sweetness of the desserts, the perfection of the roasts, never knowing the risk that passed their lips with each bite. Judith's world was this world, a life shaped in the glow of hearth fire, in the monotony of rolling dough, in the sharp scent of nutmeg scraped into a custard. She knew the masters well, knew their voices, their moods, their hungers. She listened when they laughed, when they schemed, when they let their guard down over a glass of brandy. She was to them invisible, as all cooks were meant to be. Yet in her invisibility, she was everywhere. The kitchen gave her access not only to their food, but to their most human vulnerabilities. Plantation kitchens were also places of secrecy, not just for the enslaved, but for the enslavers. Behind those doors, the illusion of Southern gentility was stripped bare. Masters who dined on porcelain plates in the candlelit dining room would shove scraps into the hands of their servants without looking at their faces. The grandeur of a dessert course, layered cakes, sugared fruits, pies glistening with glaze, was built on the backs of the enslaved, their labor unseen by those who boasted of wealth. And yet, within these contradictions, Judith's story took root. To understand how desserts could become deadly, one must understand what sugar meant in that world. Sugar was more than sweetness. It was wealth, status, a symbol of the empire the South sought to build. Plantations were drenched in it, their profits soaked in molasses and refined crystals shipped across oceans. Desserts, therefore, were not luxuries, they were statements of power. Every spoonful of custard was a declaration that the master had conquered not only land and labor, but also leisure. Yet the irony was cruel. The very substance that symbolized control became the instrument of rebellion. Judith moved in this world, unseen yet central. Every day she entered the kitchen, she entered a battlefield where weapons did not clang but simmered quietly in pots. She knew the herbs that could ease pain, and she knew the ones that could stop a heart. She understood the fragile line between nourishment and poison, between trust and betrayal. For a master, dessert was the final note of pleasure. For Judith, it could become the final note of vengeance. The plantation kitchen was not a sanctuary. It was a cage. But it was a cage with cracks through which a determined hand could push. Judith's life was bound by oppression, but in those kitchens, she had something rare: proximity. She could touch what others could not. She could place something in front of a master that would pass his lips without question. No other enslaved role carried that kind of power disguised as servitude. The darkness of her story begins here, in these suffocating kitchens where history preferred silence. Here, amid the heat and smoke, the desserts that symbolized civilization were transformed into something else, into warnings, into weapons, into secrets so disturbing they were nearly erased. The kitchens, which to outsiders seemed like spaces of domesticity, were in truth places where the boundaries between life and death blurred, where trust was both demanded and misplaced. It was in this hidden corner of the plantation world that Judith rose, not merely as a cook, but as the quiet architect of something far more dangerous. Judith did not rise in the way masters or mistresses imagined. There were no promotions, no acknowledgments of skill, no freedom granted as a reward. Her rise was invisible, like the steam that lifted off boiling pots, like the scent of cinnamon drifting unnoticed from the kitchen to the dining room. She was born into bondage, into a world where her name was not her own and her body was not hers to protect. Yet within the narrow confines of a plantation kitchen, she cultivated something dangerous: mastery. Not mastery of land or men, but of recipes, flavors, and the rhythms of life inside the house that fed on her labor. Cooks on the plantation were rarely chosen by accident. Judith's selection marked her out as someone observant, steady, and capable of learning the subtle arts of pleasing a fickle palate. It was not a glamorous role, though outsiders might have envied it over field work. It was relentless, exhausting, and filled with peril. A burnt roast or a sour cream could bring punishment. Yet over time, Judith learned to read the moods of her masters and the seasons of their appetites. She knew how to mask spoiled meat with heavy spice, how to coax sweetness from fruit that should have been thrown away, how to stretch meager supplies into feasts. These small acts of ingenuity made her indispensable, and in the twisted logic of the plantation system, indispensability gave her both burden and opportunity. The women who worked alongside her whispered of herbs and roots that could heal or harm. Some of these whispers were remnants of African knowledge, smuggled across oceans in memory rather than luggage. Others were gleaned from observation of the land, from quiet exchanges with native women, or from hidden books that passed through curious hands. Judith listened. She was careful not to speak too much, careful not to reveal how much she absorbed. But she remembered. In a world where she owned nothing, memory was the one thing that could not be stripped away. Her desserts became her signature, the dishes for which the masters praised her most often, though never by name. They would boast to visiting guests of the plantation cook, who made pies as delicate as any in New Orleans, custard smooth enough to rival those in Charleston. But Judith's face never appeared in their stories. She existed only as a pair of unseen hands, as if the pies baked themselves. Invisibility was her curse, yet it was also her cloak. While the master spoke over her, she listened. While they toasted each other at the table, she watched from the shadows. She noticed what they ate with greed and what they left untouched. She noticed how much they drank, how their laughter grew loose, how their guard dropped when bellies were full. It was in these moments that Judith's quiet power began to take shape. She was not free, but she was near. Nearer than any overseer, nearer than most wives. The masters trusted their cooks not out of kindness, but because they had no choice. They could not feast without them. And so, by necessity, Judith stood closer to their lives and their deaths than they ever realized. Her reputation in the quarters was different. Among the enslaved, she was known not only for her skill, but for her sharpness of mind. There were rumors that she could slip bitterness into sweetness, that her desserts carried meanings only the enslaved understood. Perhaps it was the way she shared her recipes with care, withholding certain ingredients, as if to keep something for herself. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, quiet but never broken. To the masters she was silent obedience. To the enslaved she was a woman who saw more than she let on. The first death seemed like coincidence. A pie, eaten with relish, followed by fever and convulsions. The doctor muttered about tainted shellfish, about the heat of the season. Judith said nothing, her face unreadable, but she had noticed the satisfaction in the man's eyes as he swallowed the last bite, and she had noticed the way his body shook only hours later. She noticed too how the household hushed the incident, how the death was spoken of as if it were natural, inevitable. The silence was telling. When another master, dining on the same delicacy, collapsed days later, the whispers began. Some muttered about poison, others spoke of curses, of roots and powders hidden in plain sight. The more superstitious swore Judith's desserts carried shadows, that her pies were sweetened not with sugar but with spite. The men laughed at such talk in public, but behind closed doors unease spread. Judith herself did not boast. She remained composed, careful, deliberate. That was her strength. No wild outburst, no careless word ever betrayed her. She worked as she always had, rolling dough, sprinkling nutmeg, stirring custards with steady hands. But with every death, her reputation deepened. To some she was a witch, to others a quiet hero. To herself, perhaps she was neither. She was simply a woman who had found, in the narrowest of margins, a way to reach for something forbidden. Control. Control, for Judith, did not come from open rebellion or from running into the swamps. It came from the intimate knowledge that men who claimed to own her depended on her food, her skill, her desserts. It came from the certainty that each spoonful carried not only sweetness, but choice. Hers, not theirs. And that knowledge must have burned within her, a flame no punishment could extinguish. As the deaths mounted, the plantations grew tense. Masters began to look at their cooks differently, no longer with casual trust, but with a flicker of fear. Some demanded that their wives oversee every step of the kitchen, though the wives lacked the skill to truly understand. Others brought in new servants, hoping fresh hands would keep their food safe. Yet still the shadow lingered, for it was never the cook's face they truly feared. It was the possibility that the kitchen itself had become a place of judgment. Judith remained at the center of it all, unmoved. Her rise was not measured in years of freedom or acres of land, but in the weight of silence that followed her work. The masters had learned to fear her, though they could never admit it aloud, and the enslaved had learned to watch her, to see in her calm precision a kind of defiance wrapped in sugar and spice. She had become something rare on a plantation, a woman whose presence unsettled those who claimed to hold absolute power. Her rise, then, was not the rise of a name celebrated in history books. It was the rise of a shadow in the kitchen, a whisper passed through quarters, a story so dangerous that records tried to erase it. But erasure itself tells us how deeply her story cut. For a woman enslaved to move unseen yet strike with such precision, this was something the world of masters could not abide. The deaths began as whispers, barely more than rumors drifting through tobacco smoke and clinking glasses at the tables of the southern elite. At first, no one wanted to believe that something as simple, as comforting as a dessert could be connected to death. The first plantation master who fell had eaten heartily, laughing with guests, praising the custard Judith had prepared. Hours later, he doubled over with agony, his body racked with cramps, his skin pale and clammy. The doctor called it a fever, perhaps a bad oyster from the coast, an unfortunate but natural end. Yet in the kitchen, where silence was law, Judith stood at the stove, her face unreadable, her hands already preparing for the next meal. When the second man died, the pattern became harder to ignore. He too had eaten well, enjoying the same dessert that had delighted the first. He too had fallen suddenly, his body twisting in pain that no tonic could relieve. Still his family refused to speak of poison. They whispered of bad luck, of God's judgment, of the swampy heat bringing disease. To suggest that food had been tampered with was to admit vulnerability, And the men who owned hundreds of acres and hundreds of lives could not bear to imagine themselves at the mercy of a woman in their own kitchens. But 3 deaths became 4, and 4 became 5. By the 6th, silence no longer sounded like denial, it sounded like fear. Across plantations, the conversation shifted in tone. Men who once boasted about their lavish tables began to eye their food suspiciously. They asked questions they had never asked before. Who prepared this? Who tasted it first? Was the sugar imported or local? They laughed it off in public, but their wives noticed how uneasily they picked at their plates, how their hands lingered before lifting a spoon. The enslaved, meanwhile, whispered different stories. They saw the pattern more clearly than anyone else, for they lived closest to it. They watched the masters grow sick, one after another, each time following a dessert crafted by Judith's steady hands. Some said she had learned the secret of bitter herbs, that she could grind seeds so fine they dissolved unseen into custard. Others swore she had inherited old knowledge, carried in bloodlines from across the ocean, knowledge of roots and powders that could sicken or kill. The more superstitious among them whispered of spirits, of pacts with forces that lingered in the dark corners of the plantation, watching, waiting. By the time the 8th man died, the rumor had hardened into legend. He too had been undone after a sweet dish prepared by Judith. The official cause was never spoken aloud, but in the quarters, the conclusion was certain. The desserts had become weapons. The same sugar that symbolized wealth and refinement had turned into a vehicle of vengeance. This was not just about food, it was about trust. Masters had always trusted their cooks because they had no other choice. They sat at the table each evening, believing themselves untouchable, believing their wealth insulated them from harm. They could beat a man in the field until his body gave way. They could separate a mother from her children without remorse. But when they sat down to dine, their survival depended on the unseen hands of those they considered less than human. Judith's desserts shattered that illusion. With each death, the invisible line between master and servant blurred. Power, it turned out, could flow in the opposite direction, carried in something as delicate as a slice of pie. The master's fear was never recorded openly. To write it down would have been to admit it. Plantation ledgers carried on with their lists of crops and supplies, but in the dining rooms, unease spread like a shadow. Some men began refusing dessert altogether. Others demanded that their wives or overseers taste the first bite. Still others stopped hosting lavish dinners, claiming frugality, though the truth was simpler, they were afraid. The very thing that had once displayed their wealth had become a reminder of their fragility. For Judith, each death added to a story that would not be told in the open but would live in whispers. She had found a way to wound men who believed they were untouchable, to strike not with rebellion in the fields, but with a spoon, a crust, a sugared glaze. Whether she acted out of vengeance, desperation, or quiet strategy, her desserts carried a message no master wanted to hear. They were not invincible. The 8th death sealed her legacy in shadow. 8 men, all tied together by the same unseen thread, falling one after another in a pattern too sharp to ignore. The world beyond the plantations may never have known her name, but in the quarters, Judith became something more than a cook. She became a figure of possibility, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of bondage, there were ways to fight back, ways that could not be chained or whipped out of existence, and yet the silence that followed was heavy. No trial records, no confessions, no official acknowledgement. It was as if the masters had collectively agreed to bury the story, to erase Judith from the paper trail of history. But absence speaks louder than presence. That deliberate silence tells us just how deeply the fear had cut, how dangerous her story was to those who relied on the illusion of absolute control. The memory of 8 dead men lingered, tied forever to desserts that had once symbolized comfort and luxury. In that silence, Judith's legend grew. Perhaps she vanished into the swamps. Perhaps she was executed in secret. Perhaps she lived out her days in anonymity on another plantation. We cannot know for certain. What we can know is that her story was too dangerous to be written openly, too threatening to the foundations of power to be remembered in full. And that is what makes it so haunting. For every pie cooling on a windowsill, for every cake placed proudly on a master's table, there was a shadow. The memory of desserts that killed, of sweetness that concealed bitterness, of a woman who turned sugar into a weapon sharper than steel. The South had always thrived on whispers, on the unspoken things that moved faster than the ink of official ledgers. After the first plantation master fell, explanations had been simple: disease, fever, bad food. But as the deaths spread, so too did the stories. They traveled not only across the quarters, passed from one enslaved worker to another in hushed tones by firelight, but also across dining tables where wealthy men sipped wine and tried not to let their hands tremble. By the fourth death, the air itself seemed to carry unease. Something was wrong, and everyone felt it, though no one dared put the truth plainly. The enslaved spoke of poison, though not always in the literal sense. Some swore Judith had mastered the art of powders, crushed peach pits, ground seeds, bitter roots that when slipped into custard could burn a man's stomach from the inside out. Others believed she had turned to old knowledge, the kind of remedies and rituals carried across the Middle Passage in memory. They said she could speak to spirits, that her hands worked not just with flour and sugar but with curses, weaving darkness into every crust she laid upon the master's tables. And some, more cautious, said it was not magic but cleverness, that Judith knew exactly how much to add, exactly when to stir, exactly how to mask the bitterness with sweetness, so no tongue could catch it until it was too late. Among the masters, explanations were different, though no less fearful. They whispered of rebellion, of secret plots among the enslaved, of cooks conspiring to strike where no overseer could watch. The more superstitious among them muttered about witchcraft, about the devil walking in their kitchens. And yet in public they insisted nothing was wrong. They raised their glasses, praised the richness of their tables, carried on the performance of control. But in private, their eyes flickered to their plates with hesitation. Their wives noticed how they no longer lingered over desserts, how they sometimes asked a servant to take the first bite. Fear is a peculiar thing. It spreads faster than truth, faster than proof. It does not need evidence, only suggestion. With each death, the suggestion deepened. 8 men gone, each tied in some way to Judith's desserts. Whether it was poison or witchcraft or something unnamed, the fear became its own force, shaping behavior, tightening control, making kitchens places of suspicion rather than comfort. Judith herself became a phantom figure in these stories, both feared and admired. Among the enslaved, she was spoken of with awe. Some called her brave, a woman who had found a way to strike back where no whips could reach. Others called her dangerous, for they knew master's wrath could easily fall upon the innocent if her secret was exposed. Among the masters, she was hardly ever named. They spoke instead of the cook or the kitchen. To name her was to admit she had power, and that was something their pride could not allow. The rumors of witchcraft clung most stubbornly. The South was steeped in superstition, and the idea that enslaved people carried hidden knowledge terrified the ruling class. Folktales about charms, powders, and hexes had circulated for years, usually as a way of mocking or dismissing African traditions. But Judith's desserts forced those tales into sharper focus. If one woman could kill with her cooking, what might others be doing in silence? Could every meal, every sip of coffee, every glass of wine conceal a threat? That question spread like wildfire, unanswerable, uncontainable. The fear was not limited to the masters. Mistresses, too, felt it. They had long viewed the kitchen as their domain, even though they rarely lifted a hand to cook themselves. They took pride in presenting elaborate tables to their guests, in claiming the credit for meals their enslaved cooks prepared. Now that pride was poisoned. To serve dessert was no longer simply to flaunt wealth. It was to wonder whether one's own husband might die from the sweetness. Some women began entering the kitchens more often, watching the work, trying to assert control. But they did not have the skill, and their presence only bred resentment. The cooks worked silently, faces blank, while suspicion grew like mold in the corners. Rebellion, poison, witchcraft. Theories blurred together until they no longer mattered. What mattered was the atmosphere of dread. A pie cooling on the windowsill no longer smelled like comfort. It smelled like risk. A slice of cake no longer brought delight but hesitation. The rituals of dining, which had once reinforced hierarchy, now exposed its fragility. For every master who lifted a spoon, there was a moment of doubt, a fleeting thought that perhaps he would not live to taste another. Judith's role in this spreading fear was both direct and symbolic. Direct, because her desserts had undeniably preceded death. Symbolic, because her story represented something larger. The possibility that the enslaved were not powerless, that they could strike in ways the masters could not predict or prevent. Fear, once rooted, does not stay contained. It seeps into the walls, into the routines, into the very air. And on the plantations touched by Judith's story, it lingered with every meal, every glance, every whisper. That fear also silenced. To acknowledge openly what was happening would have meant admitting vulnerability. It would have meant admitting that the very foundation of their world, the control of enslaved bodies, was not as absolute as they pretended. And so they chose silence. They buried the stories, erased the names, wrote death off as disease. But the whispers did not stop. They carried on in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the fields, growing heavier with every retelling. In this way, Judith's deserts lived on long after the last master fell. They lived not only in memory but in the unease that settled over plantation society. Sugar, once the sweetest symbol of wealth, now carried a bitter aftertaste. Desserts, once a luxury of abundance, became reminders of mortality. The fear that spread through those households was not simply fear of death, but fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of realizing that the people they had enslaved might be stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than they ever allowed themselves to believe. It was not rebellion in the fields, not an uprising with torches and blades. It was something quieter, something that slipped unnoticed onto the dining table, hidden in the folds of pastry and the sheen of caramel. And in that quietness lay its greatest terror. For if death could come from something as ordinary as dessert, then where was safety? If sweetness itself could carry poison, what could ever again be trusted? That was the question Judith's desserts left behind, a question that echoed through the South long after her name had been buried. The silencing of Judith's story was not an accident. It was a deliberate act, carried out by those who understood the danger of truth. Plantation records, so meticulous in their documentation of cotton bales and corn harvests, suddenly grew vague when it came to the deaths of 8 men. A doctor's note might mention illness or fever. A ledger might mark the passing of an owner with no explanation. But nowhere did anyone dare to write down the possibility that a slave woman had wielded power through the very food they ate. To commit such words to paper would have been to acknowledge that the hierarchy was not ironclad, that the enslaved had agency that could not be chained. And so the silencing began. Judith's name appeared briefly in the records, a cook assigned to the household, and then it disappeared as if erased. It is possible she was executed quietly, her body buried without ceremony, her death explained as punishment for defiance. It is possible she was sold away, her presence removed from the household to eliminate the memory of her defiance. Or perhaps she fled into the swamps, slipping into the thick shadows where fugitives carved out fragile survival. We cannot know with certainty because those who held the power of the pen ensured that we would not. But the absence of evidence speaks volumes. History rarely forgets the deeds of men who owned land and slaves. Yet here was a case in which 8 powerful masters died under circumstances too similar to be dismissed. And still, the archives are almost silent. That silence is its own confession. It tells us that Judith's actions were too threatening to preserve, too corrosive to the mythology of control that the South depended upon. To admit her existence was to admit that even in their most private pleasures, masters were vulnerable. What is most chilling is how quickly society closed ranks to maintain the silence. Plantation mistresses, who might have known the truth or at least suspected it, had reasons to keep quiet. To acknowledge that a cook had killed their husbands, brothers, or sons would have been to admit that their own homes were unsafe, that their authority over domestic life was a fragile illusion. Overseers who prided themselves on maintaining order would not have dared to confess that danger had risen not from the fields they patrolled with whips, but from the kitchens they overlooked. Even clergy, who thundered about obedience from their pulpits, would have found the story too unsettling. What sermon could they preach if the faithful congregation knew that their dinners might carry judgment from the very people they enslaved? The silencing extended beyond words. The enslaved themselves learned to speak carefully, to trade the story in whispers rather than shouts. To be heard repeating it too boldly could mean punishment, even death. And yet, even under threat, the story persisted. For the enslaved, Judith's silence became a form of resistance. Though her name was nearly erased from official records, it lived in the oral tradition, passed along as a secret history. Mothers might caution their daughters about the dangers of kitchens, but also remind them of the hidden strength within them. Men in the fields might whisper of the cook who brought down 8 masters, not as gossip, but as a symbol, a reminder that the system was not invulnerable. The silence also reveals something about fear. It was not enough for the masters to suppress rebellion by force. They had to suppress the very memory of defiance. They understood that stories are powerful, that tales of an enslaved woman who could kill with desserts would spread faster than whips could silence. If Judith's story became widely known, it might inspire others to experiment, to resist quietly, to find ways of striking at the heart of power. So they smothered the tale under layers of omission. They let the memory rot in shadow rather than let it bloom in light. Still, traces remain. A half-erased note in a ledger, a rumor in a diary, a gap where there should have been detail. These fragments are enough to suggest the outline of the truth. And in some ways, the absence is more damning than presence. Because if 8 deaths had truly been caused by bad oysters or seasonal fevers, why would records grow so cautious? Why would Judith's name vanish so suddenly? Why would households that once boasted of their tables cease to mention their cook at all? Silence, in this case, is louder than words. The silencing also highlights how history itself is shaped, not only by what is remembered but by what is deliberately forgotten. The South told stories of loyalty, of faithful slaves who served their masters with devotion. Judith's story stood in direct contradiction to that narrative. To preserve her name would have been to admit that devotion could be a mask, that service could conceal rebellion. Better then to let her vanish, to erase her from the narrative and pretend she had never existed. But erasure does not destroy truth. It lingers like a shadow, like the bitter aftertaste in a too-sweet dessert. It waits for someone to notice the gaps, to ask the forbidden questions, to piece together what others tried to bury. Judith's silencing reveals not only her strength, but the fragility of the system that sought to erase her. For if power were truly absolute, if control were truly unshakable, there would have been no need to hide her story. The very act of silencing proves the fear she inspired. In the end, Judith's name may not appear in the history books written by the victors, but her absence speaks as powerfully as presence. The South buried her story because it revealed too much. The hypocrisy of refinement, the vulnerability of power, the strength of those who were supposed to be voiceless. And though the written record tried to erase her, the whispers survived, carrying forward the memory of a woman who turned sugar into a weapon, whose desserts became a legend too dangerous to record. The memory of Judith did not simply vanish when her name was scrubbed from ledgers and her presence erased from plantation accounts. Instead, it drifted into another realm of preservation, the oral traditions of those who had every reason to remember. Around fires in the quarters, in the hushed conversations of women kneading bread or weaving cloth, and in the quiet confidences of old men too weary to fear the overseer's ears, her story endured. It became less about one woman and more about what she represented, a fleeting but undeniable proof that power could be inverted, that the roles imposed by chains and violence were not as permanent as the masters believed. Judith became more than a cook. She became a whisper of vengeance that traveled like smoke through the enslaved community. As time passed, her story began to shift. Some versions spoke of her desserts as potions, as though she had mastered secret knowledge that blended herbs and poisons into something irresistible. Others painted her less as a woman and more as an avenging spirit who moved silently through kitchens, smiling politely as she served plates that carried doom. Children growing up in bondage heard the story as a cautionary tale and a secret source of strength. That even within the suffocating walls of slavery, there were cracks where agency could survive. Judith's tale gave form to a dangerous idea, that even those stripped of freedom could still wield influence, even if only for a moment. What is striking about these whispered traditions is how they often blurred the line between reality and myth. Judith's act may have begun as a single chain of events, rooted in the cold logic of survival and resistance, but within the oral tradition it took on layers of meaning. To some, she was a woman who calculated every move with precision, carefully mixing poison into puddings and pies until her masters fell one by one. To others, she was almost supernatural, a figure cloaked in shadows, her recipes passed down not as instructions, but as warnings. that every bite taken by the oppressors might conceal a reckoning. This shifting, morphing tale gave it resilience. Even if the written record tried to erase her, the oral record kept her alive in forms too elusive to stamp out. Over the years, these whispers became something like folklore. Just as enslaved communities told stories of Breer Rabbit or other trickster figures who outwitted stronger foes, Judith's tale joined that hidden pantheon of subversive heroes. Where the trickster relied on cunning and wit, Judith used sweetness as her disguise, her rebellion hidden beneath the glaze of cakes and the sugared crust of pies. The kitchen, usually a place of servitude, was recast as a stage for subversion. Her story suggested that rebellion could be silent, invisible, and yet devastating. And in the imaginations of the enslaved, that possibility was a balm in a world designed to crush hope. What makes this folklore especially chilling is how it might have spread beyond the enslaved quarters themselves. Rumors have a way of escaping, and whispers of Judith's deserts would not have been contained entirely. Plantation mistresses, fearful in their own kitchens, may have heard servants murmur too softly to be caught. Overseers, drunk and careless, may have heard fragments of a tale that made them eye their food with suspicion. In this way, the folklore carried a quiet terror for both sides. For the enslaved, it was inspiration. For the masters, it was paranoia, an unspoken awareness that they could never be entirely safe. The folklore also reveals something about how memory resists domination. Written history, controlled by those in power, sought to erase Judith. But oral history, fluid and communal, carried her forward. The enslaved had long relied on this method to preserve identity, culture, and defiance in a system designed to strip them of those very things. Judith's story was woven into songs, metaphors, and whispered recollections, never written down but always hovering just beneath the surface of daily life. Each retelling was an act of quiet rebellion against enforced forgetting, and as generations passed, her tale may have slipped into a broader cultural memory of resistance. After emancipation, former slaves carried fragments of stories with them, retelling them to children and grandchildren who never knew the plantations firsthand. By then, Judith may have become less a historical figure than a ghost story, a whispered warning about the costs of cruelty and the hidden weapons of the oppressed. Her desserts, once real recipes baked in sweltering kitchens, became symbols of poisoned sweetness. The idea that oppression itself could carry the seeds of destruction, concealed in the very comforts that masters believed were theirs by right. This transformation into folklore gave Judith an immortality denied to her in the written record. If she lived only as a line struck from a ledger, her story would have died with her. But through the whispers of those who refused to forget, she endured. And in that endurance lay a quiet victory. No matter how thoroughly the masters tried to erase her, she lived on in the mouths of the very people they sought to silence. They may have controlled the paper and the ink, but they could not control the tongue, nor could they prevent memory from shaping itself into something uncontainable. It is worth noting that this folklore carried risk. To speak too openly of Judith could invite punishment. To tell her story in certain company could mark someone as dangerous. And yet the enslaved told it anyway, disguising it as caution, embedding it in song, cloaking it in metaphor. The act of retelling became an act of defiance. In this way, Judith's legacy was not simply the deaths of 8 masters. It was the living act of resistance that her memory inspired for decades afterward. The haunting part of this transformation is how it reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but about how it is remembered, retold, and reshaped. Judith's story may never be recovered in its full, factual detail. Too much has been lost, buried, or silenced. But the fragments that survived, the folklore that persisted, testify to something larger than one act of rebellion. They testify to the endurance of memory in the face of erasure, to the power of oral tradition to outlast written lies, and to the dangerous allure of a story that refused to die. Even today, when scholars stumble across vague plantation records or hear faint echoes of stories passed down in families, Judith's shadow lingers. It is not history in the strict sense, but it is memory, vivid, unsettling, and enduring. And perhaps that is why her tale, whispered for centuries, still matters. Not because we can reconstruct every detail, but because the folklore itself is proof that some truths, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of surviving. The most haunting part of Judith's legacy lies not in the act itself, but in what it revealed about the fragility of power. The South prided itself on the image of invincibility, of masters who controlled every breath and movement of those they enslaved. They built a mythology around strength, refinement, and permanence, insisting that the order of things was natural and eternal. But Judith's deserts shattered that illusion in the most intimate way possible. The very table that symbolized wealth and authority became the stage of collapse. Masters who believed themselves untouchable succumbed not to swords, guns, or uprisings, but to sweetness. That irony was intolerable to a system that depended on projecting control, and so Judith's story had to be buried, not only to erase her, but to erase the possibilities she represented. There is a bitter truth beneath that silence. The oppressors feared stories more than violence. An armed rebellion could be crushed with militias and whips, but a story of quiet subversion could not be stopped once it took root. Judith's deserts carried more than poison. They carried a metaphor. They proved that authority could be inverted, that even the smallest act from the most silenced figure could ripple through the structure of power. It was not just 8 deaths they feared. It was the idea that the enslaved could look upon their masters and see vulnerability instead of invulnerability. That was a poison far more dangerous than any hidden in a cake. What Judith revealed was the hidden truth of slavery, that control was never absolute. Every master who sat down to eat afterward carried a seed of doubt, even if they would not admit it. They wondered whether the cook who ladled soup into their bowl, the woman who set a pie on the table, or the boy who carried a tray might be smiling with secrets. This unspoken tension destabilized the mythology of mastery. Judith's act may have been silenced in records, but its echo crept into the psychology of the South. The system depended on obedience appearing natural, but Judith revealed it was only enforced through fear, and fear could shift direction. The fragility of power is also seen in how desperately it clung to silence. If the South were truly confident in its dominance, it could have documented Judith as an anomaly, a criminal, an example of justice served. Instead, it chose to erase her, as though by striking her name from history, it could strike her from existence. But erasure is never proof of strength. It is proof of fear, proof that the system knew it was not as unshakable as it claimed. Judith's deserts were not just an act of rebellion. They were a mirror, showing the masters their own mortality, their own weakness, in a way no battlefield ever could. The psychological dimension is crucial here. For the enslaved, Judith's act became whispered legend, a reassurance that power could be challenged. For the masters, it became a specter, a paranoia they dared not name. That duality gave her story an enduring resonance. It revealed that power is not built solely on chains and laws, but on perception. Masters had to believe they were untouchable, and the enslaved had to believe resistance was futile. Judith cracked both illusions at once, and once cracked, illusions cannot easily be restored. What Judith teaches us is that history often hides its most dangerous truths in silence. Official accounts will tell us of battles, laws, and speeches, but the quiet acts, those performed in kitchens, in shadows, in whispers, are often the ones that change how people see the world. Judith's deserts remind us that rebellion is not always loud. Sometimes it is sweet, hidden beneath sugar and spice, and all the more effective because of its disguise. Power likes to believe it can predict and control threats, but Judith's story is a testament to the unpredictability of resistance. It comes not always from armies, but from the overlooked, the underestimated, the silenced. In a broader sense, Judith's tale forces us to reconsider the narratives of history itself. We are taught to see enslaved people as victims, stripped of agency, their lives reduced to suffering under tyranny. That suffering was real and immense, but stories like Judith's complicate the picture. They show that even in the darkest conditions, acts of defiance flickered. They show that history is not only about what the powerful recorded, but also about what the powerless preserved in whispers. The very fact that Judith's name lingers, however faintly, proves that suppression was never complete. The enduring lesson, then, is that power is brittle when it relies on silencing truth. Judith's story was meant to be erased, yet here we are, centuries later, still haunted by it. That endurance exposes the futility of erasure. The South tried to preserve its myth of control, but the survival of Judith's tale undermines that effort. It reveals that systems of oppression are never as permanent as they appear. They rest on fragile illusions, vulnerable to being broken not only by uprisings and wars, but by stories too dangerous to forget. Perhaps the most unsettling reflection is how this fragility continues to echo today. The dynamics of silence, erasure, and fear are not relics of the past. They persist wherever power seeks to bury inconvenient truths. Judith's deserts remind us that history's silences are never empty. They are filled with the echoes of suppressed voices, waiting to be heard. The danger is not only in what Judith did, but in what her erasure tells us, that the most unsettling truths are often those we are never meant to know. Judith's deserts killed 8 men, but her legacy unsettled generations. Not because of the poison, but because of the possibility. The possibility that the system was never as strong as it claimed, that every plate set on a table might carry more than food, that every smile from the enslaved might conceal defiance. That possibility could not be destroyed, and so it lingers, reshaping how we see the past and how we understand the fragility of power itself. If you've made it this far into Judith's haunting story, you already know that what we uncover here goes far beyond the pages of history books. These are the silenced truths, the fragments of memory that were never meant to survive. Yet they linger, whispering warnings and reminders that power is never as unshakable as it pretends to be. Stories like Judith's aren't simply history. They are reflections of resistance, fear, and the hidden battles fought in places where no one thought to look. And each time we bring these stories back into the light, we chip away at the silence that tried to bury them. If this episode unsettled you, if it made you question what else has been erased or hidden, then you already understand why this channel exists. Together, we are uncovering the darker corners of history, the shadows where truth was buried, and the secrets that still shape our present. But to keep doing this, I need your help. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next forgotten tale. Every new story we unearth is another piece of a puzzle that the past tried to scatter. And if this story struck you, if Judith's legacy made you think differently about history, silence, or resistance, drop your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe happened to Judith? Was she executed, erased, or did she vanish into legend? Your perspective matters, and together we keep these stories alive. Don't just watch history, be part of preserving it.